What's up, everybody? Core Use Bloody History. We're going to continue on with John Armstrong's file on Ruth Paine. And we have come to an email dated November 23rd, 1999, from Tom Blackwell to, there's no name, it just says, you and a few others on my JFK list. Subject: check out evidence indicates Oswald tapes survived. It starts off, a thought, couldn't this be a Soviet setup, where their own people place these calls and make these contacts claiming to be Oswald after the defecting Oswald disappointed them and ended up returning to the U.S.? As we continue on down, it starts a whole new paragraph within this email. It says, evidence indicates Oswald tapes survives. CIA had said it erased the embassy recording. Associated Press, Washington. Hours after President Kennedy was assassinated, FBI agents reportedly listened to a tape of a phone call that a man identifying himself as Lee Oswald had placed to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. Related story, aging JFK Memorial earns city attention. They made a startling discovery. The voice on the tape was not Oswald's, government records say. This controversial tape has been a question mark in the assassination investigation since Kennedy was killed. The assassination occurred 36 years ago Monday, and only now have we details about the tape come to life. The CIA said years ago that the tapes on which it recorded the call were erased. Documents released in recent years said otherwise. The latest and newest of declassified documents offer more evidence that the tape survived. The discovery that the voice on the tape was someone other than Oswald was a disquieting discovery because the man who impersonated Oswald was still at large, said John Newman, an ex-military intelligence analyst, author, and professor at the University of Maryland. Oswald was in Mexico City in September and October of 1963. During his one-week stay, he contacted the Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate, inquiring about visas needed to go to the Soviet Union via Cuba. It's widely known that the CIA wired telephones and took surveillance photos at both the embassy and consulate, but the agency maintained that it had routinely erased and reused tapes of the phone intercepts. Word from CIA. A message from the CIA's Mexico City station to headquarters on November 24th, 1963 said, HQ has full transcripts. All pertinent calls. Regret complete recheck shows tapes for this period already erased. It was also known that while he was in Mexico City, Oswald had contact with Valery Kostikov, a man that one CIA memo describes as a case officer in an operation which is evidently sponsored by the KGB's 13th Department responsible for sabotage and assassination. It was the caller who is thought to have impersonated Oswald who links him to this Soviet spy unit known as Department 13. Newly declassified documents, some released in the last 6 months, say that after the president was shot, a Navy plane carried a top-secret package from Mexico City to Dallas and landed there about 3 a.m., the day after the murder. Former FBI agent Eldon Rudd, later a Republican congressman from Arizona, was aboard the plane. There were no tapes to my knowledge, Mr. Rudd said in a telephone interview. I brought the pictures up from Mexico, and it was my understanding that it was just pictures. Documents contradict Mr. Rudd's understanding. A newly released memo dated November 27, 1963 from FBI headquarters to its office in Mexico City stated, quote, if tapes covering any contact subject Oswald with Soviet or Cuban embassies available, forward to Bureau for laboratory examination and analysis together with transcript. Include tapes previously reviewed Dallas if they were returned to you. And a transcript of a telephone call FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover made to President Lyndon B. Johnson just 6 hours after the plane arrived in Dallas supports the belief that FBI agents listened to a tape that suggested an impersonation. A second person. We have up here the tape and the photograph of the man who was at the Soviet embassy using Oswald's name, Hoover told Johnson, according to a transcript of that call released in 1993. That picture and the tape do not correspond to this man's voice nor his appearance. In other words, it appears there's a second person who was at the Soviet embassy down there. While they would not speculate about the identity of the caller, several assassination researchers privately offered some explanations. Oswald could have been impersonated by a CIA officer who called the Soviet embassy simply to fish for details about what Oswald was doing in Mexico City. Or maybe someone was trying to link Oswald to the KGB assassination unit before Kennedy's murder. Oswald's trip to Mexico City was only briefly addressed by the Warren Commission, which concluded in 1964 that Oswald was the lone gunman who killed Kennedy. Oswald's activities in Mexico City were investigated vigorously by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reinvestigated the Kennedy murder in the 1970s. The committee then raised the possibility of an Oswald impersonation, but said there was not sufficient evidence to firmly conclude that it had happened. All right. The next page seems to have a single calendar page, October 63, 22nd is circled. There's no notes on it. I don't know if it's Ruth Paine's or not. Okay, so let me talk about this this article that we just went over. This article that appeared November 22nd, 1999. Evidence indicates Oswald tapes survived. CIA had said it erased embassy recording. That looks like an article dated 11/22/99 from the Associated Press. That's a good article because it shows that the person on the tape, the photographs of Saul Sage and the audio recording of his voice don't match. So there was a second person involved besides Saul Sage, is what they're saying down here in Mexico City. Interesting. Next page, report of Postal Inspector I.L. Niewanner and R.L. McCoy, Bureau of Chief Postal Inspector, December 4th, 63, Fort Worth. Subject, cooperation with various agencies resulting from the assassination of President Kennedy. Postal Inspector in charge, Fort Worth, Texas, 76101. 1. This case was given personal attention at Fort Worth, Irving, and Dallas, Texas, beginning November 22nd, 1963. Last attention was given on December 2nd, 1963. On November 22nd, 1963, we traveled to Irving, Texas to check mailing addresses that might have been used by one Lee Oswald, our action being prompted by a request from the U.S. Secret Service. We learned that a forwarding order, Form 3575, was on file for this person from 2515 West 5th Street to 4907 Magazine Street, New Orleans. The change being dated May 15th, 1963. As far as could be determined, the address at 2515 West 5th was the only one ever used by Oswald at Irving. Inquiry of post office personnel disclosed that Michael Paine and his wife Ruth were receiving some mail at that address. Substitute carrier C.A. Fullwood has been carrying the route serving 2515 West 5th for the 2-week period preceding November 22nd, 1963. He stated that he had not observed the forwarding order on file and had continued to deliver mail addressed to the Oswalds to this 2515 West 5th Street address. It was his recollection that the only matter delivered by him was circular type with frequent receipts, possibly twice a week, of newspaper type material, obviously of foreign origin. J.G. Davis carried the route from the latter part of July 1963 until Fullwood took over the route. Davis resigned from the Postal Service and now works for Dallas Automotive in Dallas, Texas. Davis stated that he had continued to leave Oswald's mail in the letterbox at 2515 West 5th, no forwarding order being observed. He could not recall any specific pieces of mail for Oswald. Davis recalled that Mrs. Ruth Paine mentioned to him during the middle of September 1963 that we've been on a 2-month vacation. Davis went on to say that from the time he took over the route, latter part of July until the middle of September conversation, he had continued to place mail for the Paines or the Oswalds in the box at 2515 West 5th Street. He further stated the box would be emptied every few days, and he assumed that someone, identity unknown, had the authority to withdraw mail from this particular house letterbox. Harold W. Reed, carrier substitute carrier, delivers parcel post to 2515 West 5th, having taken over this particular delivery in the middle of September 1963. Parcels for this address are delivered by him as a mounted carrier on an auxiliary route. To the best of his recollection, he had never had any matter for delivery to a person by the name of Oswald at 2515 West 5th Street. He did not recall delivering any items at all to this particular address during the past 2 weeks. He said previous to that he would have one or two, possibly two packages on the average for Mrs. Paine each week. He could not recall details of the parcels other than to say, the best of his recollection, the parcels were around shoebox size. Information furnished to us at the Irving Post Office indicated that one C.P. Schneider, 2507 West 5th Street, was a retired postal employee and had information that would be of value in the investigation. He was contacted and stated he might have some information that would be of value to authorities investigating the assassination. It was learned, however, that Schneider was not a retired postal employee, as first information had indicated. Mr. and Mrs. Schneider reside in the second house east of 2515 West 5th, only a vacant house being between the two residences. Mr. Schneider is retired and consequently is home a good deal of the time. When we contacted him during the early evening of November 22nd, 63, he said that he had not been interviewed by any other investigators. Mr. and Mrs. Schneider said that they had first seen Mrs. Oswald at 2515 West 5th address in August of 1963. Mrs. Schneider understood from a remark made by Mrs. Paine that she, Mrs. Paine, brought Mrs. Oswald to Irving from New Orleans. Mrs. Paine having passed through New Orleans on her return trip from a trip to the state of either Ohio or Pennsylvania. Mrs. Schneider said Mrs. Paine had taken Mrs. Oswald to New Orleans at least once since August of 63, and that she had last returned from New Orleans with Mrs. Oswald approximately 1 month before our visit of November 22nd. She said Mrs. Paine had told her she brought Mrs. Oswald back to have her baby. To the best of Mrs. Schneider's recollection, the baby was around 3 weeks old at the time of our interview. Both of the Schneiders mentioned that Mrs. Oswald apparently could speak only Russian, both going on to mention that Mrs. Paine had taught Russian in a Catholic church school. Mr. Schneider said that he had seen Lee Oswald in front of the residence at 2515 West 5th Street on the preceding night at approximately 6 p.m. This would have been on the night of November 21st, 1963. Schneider said that Oswald was with his older child, a boy of some 12 to 14 months, and was alone. Shouldn't be a boy, should be a girl. Schneider told us that Mrs. Ed Roberts, 2519 West 5th Street, had told him that Oswald had taken a large package to work with him on that morning, the day of the assassination. Mrs. Roberts' information, according to Schneider, had come from one Willie Randall, 2439 West 5th Street, Randall having driven Oswald to work on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Schneider stated he understood both Randall and Oswald were employed by the Texas Schoolbook Depository, the assassination bullets having been fired from this firm's building. All right, so this is all hearsay that came from Buell Frazier. The change of address information, including the card itself, and the details of the interview with the Schneiders were discussed with you and the assistant inspector in charge, J.V. Staples, it being the understanding that the information was forwarded on to the U.S. Secret Service. Attention was also given this case at Dallas, Texas, on the night of November 24th, between the hours of 4 p.m. and midnight. During that period, we maintained a surveillance on box number 6225 at the Terminal Annex in Dallas. This particular box having been assigned to Lee Oswald, and it had been requested that the continuous surveillance to be made so that any person calling for matter addressed to the box could be questioned. During our period of duty, there were no calls made on this particular box. On December 2nd, 1963, we were in the Postal Inspector's office at Dallas, Texas at approximately 6:30 p.m. A call was received from Secret Service agent Robert A. Stewart, and he requested assistance from the inspection service, mentioning that Secret Service Inspector Kelly was requesting the assistance. We immediately went to the Secret Service offices in Irvay Street in Dallas, these offices being across the street from the Dallas main post office. Inspector Kelly stated that a letter had come in the custody of the Secret Service, same having been written in Russian by Oswald to his wife. This particular letter had been written prior to the assassination, and the wording indicated that there might be a sudden permanent separation between Oswald and his wife. Inspector Kelly stated that Oswald apparently did not have an an ability to express himself in Russian in written form. And consequently, the letter was difficult to read. That's weird. Secret Service officials surmised, however, that Oswald was telling his wife she would receive further information through a post office box in a post office on Irvay Street. Inspector Kelly said he had reason to believe that this would be a recently rented box, and that he was sure that if such a box did exist, it would have been rented within the 2 months preceding November 22nd, 1963. Mr. Kelly asked about the number of postal units with box delivery on Irvay Street in Dallas. After checking into the matter, it was determined that in addition to the main post office, box delivery was afforded at the Merchandise Mart and the South Dallas Station, these 2 units also being located on Irvay Street. Inspector Kelly said he was very much interested in learning whether or not Oswald had used a box to get word to his wife. He asked if it would be possible to check all personal type mail in the boxes which had been rented during the 2-month period preceding November 22nd. We then proceeded to the Dallas main post office and made a listing of boxes rented during the 2-month period, same being compiled from box rent applications. Then we went to these particular boxes and obtained information from the obviously personal type correspondence, this information being the type usually furnished incident to mail covers. Information was obtained, turned over to the Secret Service agents G.R. Seal and Winston Gentz, G-E-N-T-Z, this reference being in accordance with instructions from Inspector Kelly. Boxes at the Merchandise Mart and the South Dallas Station were not checked, it being our understanding that he would contact your office if this type of coverage was desired at those units. Above is a resume of attention given to the subject matter by us as of this date, signed I.L. Newaner and R.L. McCoy postal inspectors. So there's some interesting information there. Some hearsay about Oswald going to work with the rifle, possible information about another box having been opened. And so, yeah, interesting stuff. Outside contact report, 12/21/78. Name Michael Paine. Contact by telephone. I called Paine for information about the Minox camera, which was supposedly recovered by the police from his home in Irving, Texas in 63 or 64. Paine said he did own a Minox, which he had purchased at a secondhand store in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania in about 1950. He said a few months ago, a reporter from Dallas sent him poor Xerox copies of some photographs. Paine said the pictures seemed familiar to him and reminded him of photographs he took with the camera in Korea and Europe in 1950 or 51. He did not develop the film from that camera himself. He thought the police did take the camera from the house in Irving after the assassination. He does not think it was as late as 64. He doesn't recall whenever he got the camera back. Sometime in 68, his house was burglarized and the items in the drawer he kept the camera were stolen. So the camera would have been lost if he had received it back from the police after the assassination investigation. He said the camera was inoperative at the time of the assassination. It had fallen out of his pocket and into the sea. Paine said he was never pressured by anyone to say the police had recovered his camera in a search of the house or they had recovered a light meter. He said Ruth Paine never mentioned any similar pressure by anyone either. So that's covering whether or not there was a Minox camera. There's a lot of debate over whether Oswald had the camera or Michael Paine had the camera. But he's clearly saying that he did have a Minox that was taken, but that Minox was from 50 or 51. The notion having been that the camera was a new, modern, cutting edge for 63 spy camera, right? But I don't think that's the case. All right. Persons who may have information and have been overlooked. Roy Frankhauser. He worked as an undercover agent and said he was scheduled to testify before the Warren Commission until 1964, until someone in the executive branch quashed his subpoena for national security reasons. Jim, let's see if we can't find everything on Roy Frankhouser, or Ergo, if you're listening. Frankhouser, one word, Roy Frankhouser. Frankhouser said in a 1975 interview that he has information about teams organized for the Kennedy assassination by agents who infiltrated groups ranging from right to left, including the Minutemen, American Nazi Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party. Frankhouser said Michael and Ruth Paine were fellow undercover agents whom he met in 1960 when he infiltrated the Socialist Workers' Party. The Paines became involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in early 1963. According to Frankhouser, Ruth Paine was Oswald's intelligence babysitter and helped him set up a radical left-wing cover, including his one-man Fair Play for Cuba committee in New Orleans. Frankhouser also said the Paines took Oswald to New York and attended an international scientific meeting where Frankhouser met Oswald. The following independent support gives Frankhouser's story an edge of credibility. A. Many researchers believe George de Mohrenschildt was Oswald's intelligence babysitter. George de Mohrenschildt introduced Ruth Paine to Oswald, and after de Mohrenschildt left for Haiti in April of 1963, Ruth Paine was in constant touch with Oswald or his wife until November 22nd. B. Ruth Paine did go to the Northeast in September 1963, and a Secret Serviceman asked Marina Oswald if she had any knowledge about Oswald's trip to Washington, D.C., one of the cities Ruth Paine visited. 2. Furthermore, in a letter to the manager of the worker in New York City dated August 31st, 1963, Oswald applied for a job as a photographer and said he would be in New York in a few weeks. C. An international scientific organization did meet in New York in September of 1963 when Ruth Paine was in the Northeast. Its name was the Committee International de l'Organisation Scientifique, and its chief was host David Rockefeller. It met from September 16th through the 20th, 1963. Ruth Paine returned to New Orleans on September 20th. 1. New Solidarity, November 20th, 1975. Norman Kempster also reported Roy Frankhouser's revelations in the Washington Star. 2. Hearings before the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. And U.S. Government Printing Office, 1964. And 3. Hearings 22, page 169 to 170. All right, FBI, November 28th, 1963. Records of the, something is redacted, a long fucking redaction. Irving, Texas, reflect that checking account, redacted, was opened in the name of redacted. A review of this disclosed a cash withdrawal in the amount of $3,000 on August 7th, 1963 by Redacted, who purchased a cashier's check number Redacted, payable to one Redacted. This check was subsequently endorsed by Redacted and cashed at the Redacted, Dallas, Texas. On August 20th, 1963, a check was made payable to American Airlines in the amount of $152.25. The above records are confidential and should not be made public except under the issuance of a subpoena ducis tecum, which should be directed to redacted. Okay, so a lot of redactions here, but ultimately, this is, it says Paine up here in handwriting up on the right-hand corner with a question mark. This is obviously Ruth Paine buying a fucking ticket to go to Washington, D.C., to go to that meeting with David Rockefeller. All right, another one. Records of the Redacted, Texas. Redacted, reflect that. Redacted, Irving, Texas. Has maintained checking account number 70-0184-5 since January 29th of 1960. The balance of this account, November 26, 63, was $29.25.50. It was noted that on September 19th, 1963, October 18th, 1963, and November 18th, 1963, checks in the amount of $285 each, payable to Redacted from Redacted, Massachusetts, were credited to Redacted's account. A review of withdrawals disclosed that on November 20th, 63, two checks in the amount of $10.48 and $17.29 were written payable to Sears Roebuck and Company. On November 21st, 1963, a check in the amount of $20.04 was made payable to Redacted of Dallas, Texas. The above information is confidential and should not be made public except upon the issuance of a subpoena ducis tecum, which should be redirected to Redacted. All right. So, not a lot of information there, but they're obviously digging into Ruth Paine's finances, right? That's what they're doing. Outside contact report 12/21/78. Michael Paine, contact by telephone. We just have a duplicate here of the old Minox stuff. Next one, December 14th, 63. Mr. G.E. Smith advised he resides at 604 Argentia, Argentia, Apartment C, Wynwood, Dallas, Texas. He's the daytime service attendant at the Shell service station on the corner of Rock Island and Story Streets. He became so employed during April of 63. This is in Irving, Texas. The exact date is unknown to him. Smith advised that he heard conversation at the station to the effect that Robert Taylor, the mechanic, purchased a rifle from a customer, and that Taylor is of the opinion the customer was Lee Harvey Oswald. This occurred before he first became employed at this station and did not see the individual who sold Taylor the rifle. Smith stated that a woman, whose name he does not know but resides at 2515 5th Street, Irving, Texas, and who is in some way connected with the Oswalds, has been a customer at this station. She drives a 1957 Chevrolet station wagon, and he has serviced it on several occasions, including oil changes and washings. On one such occasion, he delivered groceries that were in the back of the automobile to her house and actually carried them into the house. While in her home, she mentioned to him that her children speak Russian better than they speak English, and made a flat statement, "We're Russian." Smith continued that he never knew this lady's name and still does not know it. However, in view of all the excitement that occurred in the neighborhood after the assassination of President Kennedy, he realized that she was in some way connected with Lee Oswald or Mrs. Oswald. She has come to the station for gasoline only one occasion since the assassination. Mr. Smith advised that the Shell station is located approximately 6 blocks from 2515 5th Street and may be the closest gasoline station to this address. Smith stated that he has never seen Lee Harvey Oswald other than from what he saw on television. To his knowledge, Oswald never came to his station. He stated he's never seen Jack Ruby, and to his knowledge, Jack Ruby's never come to his station. Next one, memorandum, July 22nd, 64, to Norman Redlick from Arthur Marmor, M-A-R-M-O-R, subject, Deputy Sheriff Eddie Raymond Buddy Walters. The data supplied by Deputy Sheriff Eddie Raymond Buddy Walters does not appear to have been used in the drafts of Chapter 3 and 4 of the report. There is a discrepancy between his investigative report of November 22nd, 63 and his statement to the FBI on June 18th, 64. In the report, he went to the triple underpass to look for possible marks left by stray bullets. An unknown person told him he had been hit in the face while parked on Main Street. Officer Clyde A. Haygood reported that the person near the underpass was hit by an object during the shooting. Walters said he then found where a bullet had splattered on the top edge of the curb on Main Street. He thought it was the last shot fired, which had missed. In his statement to the FBI, however, he merely said he heard 3 shots and never looked for or found a 4th bullet. Walters confirmed Patrolman McDonald's testimony that Oswald said at the time of his arrest, quote, "It's all over." He also alleged that a set of metal file cabinets were found at Irving containing records that appeared to be names and activities of Cuban sympathizers. He said this evidence was turned over to Captain Fritz and Secret Service officers. It's pretty interesting because it's pretty unlikely that ever really happened. Or if it did, it was hidden from history, right? All right. Looks like we have some more duplicate papers filed in here. A lot of times what these guys will do is they'll have a report and then they'll have a duplicate of that report with notes scribbled on it. All right. Newspaper clipping. Oswald's attempts to drive recalled. So here we go. I've discussed this a lot over time. I've made the mention that Oswald didn't drive, but I've never really gotten into details. So here, let's cover those details now. Lee Harvey Oswald had been trying to learn to drive a car during the period just prior to his arrest for killing President John F. Kennedy and Dallas patrolman J.D. Tippit. But he never did master the steering wheel. On fatal November 22nd, he had to resort to a Dallas Transit Company bus for getaway car purposes. Mrs. Ruth Paine, an Irving Russian teacher who befriended Oswald's Russian wife, told the News Tuesday that she gave Oswald a couple of driving lessons on a vacant lot. He wasn't familiar with the use of the wheel. When he turned corners, he always turned too far, she said. She said Oswald phoned the Irving residence to tell his wife that he had gone to a Department of Public Safety station to try to get a learner's permit November 16th, 6 days before the president was slain. Mrs. Paine said she understood that Oswald failed to get the permit because the station was crowded and closed before he could make the application. Oswald, who lived at an Oak Cliff rooming house during the week but visited his family in Irving on weekends, failed to come to Irving that particular weekend. Mrs. Paine said that she had the feeling that Oswald's wife had perhaps asked him not to come that weekend. He'd spent a long Veterans Day weekend in Irving the week before. Mrs. Paine's impression was that the wife feared her husband and would wear thin his welcome and requested him not to come. Mrs. Paine said that it was 2 weeks earlier, and she had given Oswald driving lessons. She said that he was making normal progress, but hadn't learned to drive. Mrs. Paine's remarks seemed to punctuate with question marks those reports of Oswald being seen several places driving a car. The Irving woman said she certainly wouldn't have loaned her car to Oswald, and she said she'd never heard him mention any friends who might have provided him with a car. See, there you go. Real simple. Oswald never drove, except for those lessons from Ruth Paine. And the reason he never drove or could get a license is because Kerry Thornley had the license in his name. Yep. Memorandum 1364, Director FBI. Attention FBI Laboratory. From the SAO, can't tell, Dallas, State's Attorney Office. Lee Harvey Oswald, ISR Cuba. That's Internal Security, Restricted Cuba. There are being forwarded under separate cover the items which are listed below. These items were the property of Lee Harvey Oswald and were obtained by the Dallas, Texas Police Department at the home of Mrs. Ruth Paine, 2515 West 5th Street, Irving, Texas, from the last known residence of Lee Harvey Oswald at 1026 North Beckley. Remember, Oswald never lived there. Dallas, Texas, and not previously forwarded for the Bureau for examination. Those items are now being forwarded to the Bureau for appropriate observation and examination, and for such comparison purposes as the Bureau deems advisable. It is requested that the following laboratory's examination, that such items as can be released by the Bureau, be returned to the Dallas office in order that they be turned over to Mrs. Marina Oswald by the widow of subject Lee Harvey Oswald. The items are as follows: a blue and black top zipper handbag with loop handles and a side zipper compartment. One yellow toothbrush, Colgate brand. One small cake-used pink soap. One small green plastic hand brush. One green and brown BB automatic ballpoint pen. One small pair of scissors bearing USMC. One package containing 14 Gillette thin blades and one sample Gillette Super Blue blade. One pair black-rimmed green lens glass sunglasses. One Farmers Electric Co-op ink advertisement ballpoint pen. One nail clipper with chain. I'm sorry, the list picked up at number 43, just so you're aware. One small hotel-type green bar of soap made by Fabrica de Jabón La Luz S.A., Mexico City. So, see, they start planting the fucking shit, right? They start planting the evidence. One white plastic cup, because Oswald never went to Mexico City. One partial tube of foil. One bottle iodine, Layman's brand. Two small brown unlabeled bottles with liquid. That was only half the list. Half the list is missing from this report. Lee Harvey Oswald, Exhibit D83, is a folded card entitled Rules for Betting, published by Hippodromo de las Americas, S.A., Mexico, D.F. This exhibit was obtained from Mrs. Ruth Paine, 2515 West 5th Street, Irving, Texas, December 4th, 1963, who had found the same in her home and advised that it belonged to Marina Oswald. The results of investigation concerning this exhibit are recorded on page 714 of the report, Special Agent Robert P. Gemberling, dated December 23rd, 63, at Dallas, Texas. Remember, it was alleged that Oswald had gone to fucking High down in Mexico City, right? But he didn't go to no fucking High. It's all bullshit. Next page, on November 22nd, 63, Mrs. Ruth Paine, 2515 West 5th Street, Irving, Texas, advised Special Agent James Bookout that her residence telephone number was BL3-1628. On November 24th, 1963, Mr. Michael Paine, 2377 Dalworth, Grand Prairie, Texas, advised Special Agent Bardwell Odom and Joseph G. Peggs that he could be reached at his employment portion of the Bell Helicopter Company located at Arlington, Texas. He provides a phone number. Once again, Ruth Paine's address book is duplicated here for no obvious reason. Despite the fact that October 23rd is supposed to have a note on it, I really can't find that note. On October 22nd, it says, baby came home, and the 23rd is empty. I see nothing about the rifle on here that's supposed to be here. Supposedly on the 22nd of November, Ruth Paine at 9:15 a.m. had an appointment with a Lynn Fowler or Lawler. I can't read that. All right. Looks like we have a police report possibly. Michael Paine has a second car, an automobile, which was parked outside his residence at 2512 West 5th Street in Irving, Texas during 1963. I think that's wrong. It's 2515. Bearing 63 Texas plates and apparently not used. In late November 64, she called the FBI in Fort Worth and reported the matter to Mr. Carter, since she felt it strange the car was not being used and still bore a 63 Texas plate. Several weeks later, after she had contacted the FBI, she observed the car to have a 64 plate, NY980. She considers this to be very peculiar. This must be a neighbor. She furnished to the Warren Commission during the course of her testifying a photograph of the assassination scene, which she had obtained from an issue of the Saturday Evening Post about 5 days after the assassination. A copy of the photograph appears with her testimony in Volume 16 of the Warren Commission report. A copy of this photograph also appears in the publication 4 Dark Days in History, page 4 and 5. The extreme left side of this photograph, as one faces the photograph, bears the picture of an individual whom she believes to be Jack Ruby. In subsequent photographs appearing in papers and magazines, the segment of the photograph bearing Ruby's picture has been deleted. In the above-mentioned photograph bearing Ruby's picture, there is a hand in the vicinity of Ruby's head. She believes that one of the shots taken at President Kennedy came from a gun held in this hand, the identity of this person not known to her. She feels that for some reason the photograph, which she originally furnished to the commission, had been altered. She feels this should be investigated to determine the reason for doing so. She feels similarly that the photograph appearing on page 19 of Time magazine dated 2/14/64 depicting her son's arrest has been altered and possibly faked, since in various Time publications of a similar date, the face on the right side is partially and in some instances completely blacked out. She feels that some ulterior motive prompted the faking or altering of these photographs. Another thing she feels to be very peculiar is the fact that the Warren Commission gave the wife of her son Lee red carpet treatment. Oh, this is from Marguerite Oswald. During the entire investigation, and commission gave her a rough time, in that the members appeared to have a hostile attitude towards her during the course of questioning her. She also feels that for some reason that bears investigation. The photo of her son Lee appearing on the cover of the 2/21/64 issue of Life was altered. She was at the Paine residence on the night of the assassination and recalled at about 2 a.m. on the morning following day, Paine went into a room which she thought at the time was a bedroom, but has since found out was a door to question leads to the garage. She feels possibly that this purpose going into the garage at this time was to plant, for some reason, certain photographs of her son Lee, which the Dallas police found when they searched the premises the following Saturday. Another very suspicious circumstance was the fact that Secret Service agent Mike Howard advised two reporters in Dallas at the time of the assassination that he was in Hotel Texas in Fort Worth, when in fact the assassination photograph showed him to be riding in the car directly behind President Kennedy's car. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and screenshot this. I don't believe this is correct at all, but I think that we at least need to look into this. If Mike Howard was in the fucking Secret Service follow-up car, that's earth-shaking, ground-breaking. But I don't think it's true. But we need to look into it. Mike Howard and the Secret Service car. She also felt that since the Secret Service took herself, her son Robert, and Lee's wife to protective custody during the period of 1124 to 1128, the Secret Service may have known that her son Lee and his wife were secret government agents, and for this reason wanted to protect Lee's wife. She feels that because of the above, the matter warrants additional investigation, and she plans to continue her efforts to prove her son was framed and did not kill President Kennedy. Copies of PD 302 reflecting the above information are being prepared and will be furnished to the Dallas office. Mrs. Oswald stated that she preferred not to be identified as the source of this information. However, she felt the information furnished by her was new information, and she would like to have an opportunity to present it in person to investigating authorities in Washington. Since Los Angeles is not aware of the nature of information previously furnished by Mrs. Oswald, no LNM is being submitted unless advised to the contrary by the Bureau. Yeah, then Margarita Oswald, after the assassination, she's a little bit of a kook. To Director FBI from SAC Los Angeles, read Jack Ruby. For the information of the Bureau, Miss Marguerite Oswald was interviewed at her request at the Hollywood Plaza Hotel, 1637 North Vine Street, room 909, Hollywood, California, on 31065 by S.A.'s Willie R. White and Philip B. Diley, D-E-I-L-Y. Mrs. Oswald furnished the following information. Her permanent residence address is Post Office Box 9578, Fort Worth, Texas. She's been in the Los Angeles area since 2/27/65 and plans to return to Fort Worth, Texas on 3/11/65. She's been investigating the alleged responsibility of her son, Lee Harvey Oswald, for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and believes that he was framed. She feels that the federal government also shares this view and may be secretly continuing the investigation of the matter, that possibly her son Lee and his wife were secret United States government agents, or that the entire matter was planned by certain people in government to place President Johnson in the office of the presidency. She considers Michael Paine her chief suspect as the true assassinator of President Kennedy. That's kind of funny. All right, copy 2. Report of Charles J. Weiland, Office, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, date January 6, 64. Title Lee Harvey Oswald. Character, Internal Security, Restricted, Cuba. Synopsis. Officers and Records of American Preparatory School, Russian American Citizens Club, Allied Language Newspapers, Russian Brotherhood Organization of the USA, and Universal School for Languages, all Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, failed to reflect any information concerning Oswald or Ruth Hyde Paine. Officers unable to explain how Oswald had names in his possession. Details at Philadelphia reference the address book of Lee Harvey Oswald. Dr. Maurice Lipschutz, Director, American Preparatory School, 1212 Spruce Street, and interpreter for the Intelligence Department of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, Philadelphia. Advised he teaches numerous languages, including Russian, at this school. Past records of students and correspondence have been destroyed, and he was unable to recall having received correspondence, or communicated with Lee Harvey Oswald or Ruth Hyde Paine. Lipschutz stated, although his school is known as the American Preparatory School, it is sometimes referred to as a Russian language school. Most of the classes in this school are on an individual basis, and he has made it his practice to become associated to all his students. Rosalie Wagman, bookkeeper, Allied Language Newspapers, Jefferson Building, 1015 Chestnut Street, advised Philadelphia office of the Russian daily paper accepts only classified advertisements. A review of her records failed to reflect any reference to Lee Harvey Oswald or Ruth Hyde Paine. The list of subscribers and correspondence is maintained at the office of Novoye Roskoye Slovo, 243 West 56th, New York. Wagman was unable to explain How the name the Russian daily paper Jefferson Building was in the possession of Oswald. Next, 1231-63, Dr. H. Walter Wenkert, Director, Universal School for Languages, 216 South 20th Street, advises he teaches and arranges for language training for approximately 12 foreign languages, including Russian, and in the past, his institution has often been referred to as the Russian Language Training School. Wenkert reviewed his records and stated he was unable to recall or locate any reference to Lee Harvey Oswald or Ruth Paine. Wenkert further stated he does not teach all of these languages, but does make arrangements for them to meet with other language specialists, but all the students must pass through his office before being enrolled. Wenkert stated he was unable to recall Oswald or Paine, could not recall ever having received any correspondence from them. Wenkert was unable to explain how the name Russian Language Training School, 216 South 20th Street, ever got into the address book of Oswald, unless it was copied from the Philadelphia telephone directory. John Drimack is next page, 2747 Snyder Avenue. Advised he'd been the secretary, vice president, and trustee of the Russian American Citizens Club, 2730 Snyder Avenue, since 56, and was unable to recall the names Lee Harvey Oswald and Ruth Hyde Paine ever being associated with that club. Drimack stated, although unknown members frequently attended socials sponsored by the club, they must be accompanied by known members and are usually known by the officers of the club. Drimack stated Oswald and Paine are unknown to him. He was unable to explain how the name of his club was ever referred to Oswald. All right. That brings us to a letter, a series of exhibits, which we will pick up first thing tomorrow. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in later for a new episode of Bloody History, World War II. And that's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks.